Welcome to class. Today we are going to talk about language and gender. Gender is Gender has become a point of discussion and an avenue for research after 1960s. In the early 60s and 70s, the issue of gender has emerged in social sciences and various disciplines with multidisciplinary approach. Scholars are engaged in understanding the social concept called social category called gender, and the field of linguistics, specifically emergence of social linguistics post 1960s, had seen a huge interest and a very wide study, wider spectrum of study and research and publications since 1970s. We get a specific mention and a very categorical discussion of women's language in Otto Jesperson's work of 1922, a chapter dedicated to it, the woman, a chapter dedicated in this book. And since then, there was a almost like no challenge to that idea Jesperson's put forward. But in 1975, a monumental work appeared by Robin Lecoff, and that changed. So today we'll take a very brief note on this relationship between language and gender. As we know, we are all born with a particular sex, right? As a girl, as a boy. So sex is biological, right? It's an outcome of reproduction system. So we are born as a boy, we are born as a girl, but the term gender is socially constructed. So sex is biological and gender is social. It is socially constructed. So a set of roles expected by a particular sex to perform refers to gender. So gender is the social role that we perform as a sex, as a particular sex, whether a man or a woman, right? So this is a very interesting and significant development that took place in late 60s and early 70s, where gender became the object of study, and that too focused study in applied linguistics and social linguistics. Now the gender differences in language can be understood at two different levels. Number one, how language encodes gender, or the form and the structures available in a language that represents gender, that attends to gender, right? So the presence of gender centric expressions, words, and structures. So at the formal level, we can understand gender in language. Like, in Hindi, we have all the nouns with a particular gender. So car is feminine, truck is masculine. So that is, assigned gender to it, grammatical gender. Hindi has grammatical gender. For example, Ram आम खाता है, सीता रोटी खाती है. खाता है masculine marker, खाती है feminine marker, and verb agrees with the gender of the subject. So खाना is verb, agrees with gender of the subject. Ram आम खाता है, and Again, सीता रोटी खाती है. So, खाती है has e ending verb marker that denotes feminine gender, right, of the subject. So, Hindi has grammatical gender, right, and even the non-animates in Hindi have genders. Pen must feminine, right? So, but there is something called biological sex, and this is grammatically assigned in such cases. Meri car, my car, right? So, long e ending that denotes feminine gender in Hindi, and that's broadly. There are certain exceptions, but broadly, this is the feminine marker. So, you can understand the relationship between gender and language in terms of the forms, the structures, and this is reflected in vocabulary very prominently. But Hindi has grammatical gender as well. Verb has to agree with the gender of the subject. Then the other perspective with which we can look at gender is the gender roles performed and how language is used, how utterances are used, right? So, how language is used by different gender roles, the difference between genders while using language in terms of a style, choice in discourse. So, how woman speaks and how a man speaks. So, one is the form. The one perspective is looking at the form and the structure present in language and how language represents the bias towards gender. The second one is how language is used by different genders. So, youth-centric, user-centric and youth-centric, right? So, the idea that women's speech is deficient and limited was first brought into discussion by Otto Jespersen in his work The Woman, a chapter in his 1922 book called Language, Its Nature and Development and Origin, published in 1922, right? And this idea that woman's language is deficient, restricted, right, reflects the social structure of the time. And we all know that post 60s, 70s, we see a rise in demands and struggle for women empowerment, and it has changed lots of expressions in language as well. It has been reflected and represented in the language as well, right? So, chairman is no more a chairman, now we call chairperson. A sportsman is no more a sportsman, we call it a sportsperson. And there is a accusation, and to a great extent it is absolutely right, that languages, right, are male biased towards men, biased towards male. So there is an argument that we see the world through the lenses of men, right? You don't have to go too far. Look at a word like Mr. Mr. is an honorific marker which we prefix with any name to honor a person, to show respect to a person. The feminine equivalent of Mr. is mistress. But can we use mistress in any public place to represent a woman? What goes in? Why Mr. is honorific, respectful, and why not mistress? So mistress means something else, right? It represents an extramarital affair, and a woman is seen as she is looked down upon. So we don't use misters. If you look at the abusive terms in any language, which is so the terms directed towards men, so number of such expressions will be counted very small. But when you look at the curse words and abuses directed towards women, all languages have plenty of them. Language bias. This is bias we are talking about, right? Somehow, if you look at the expressions, right, like my lord, honorific marker, my lord, a respectful mode of addressing the justice, the judge, or any noble person. But can we say my lady? So the feminine equivalent of lord is lady. So I can say my lord, but can I say my lady? So these biases, because when we see these expressions in the language, they are not at equal level. These expressions are somehow biased towards men. Look at examples like, when we refer to uh, something whose gender is not known. So by default, we represent he. Right? By default, we mention he, right? Not she. But of late, recently, it's a recent development where we have been using the terms like his and her, he and she. So we are, juxtaposing she with he, her with him. But it is a recent development. So because of ideological shift and struggle for women empowerment, things are changing in language as well. Expressions are changing. But that is true. That Jesperson mentioned the woman's language as deficient, and this idea was not challenged until 1975, when a monumental work by Robin Lakoff emerged, right? And that changed the discourse on gender and language. So there are three main approaches to understand the relationship between language and gender that we practice in social linguistics and applied linguistics, which emerged from 1970 onwards, and these are deficit approach, number 2 dominance approach, and number 3 difference approach. So we have three approaches to understand language and gender. Deficit approach, as the name suggests, women's language is seen as deficient. Dominance approach, that represents and reflects male dominance and the consequent deficient speech by women. And the third is a very democratic, flexible approach where women and men are seen as two categories which socialize in two different subcultures. So, difference approach, right? So, if you want to go deeper into this idea, you can look at two important publications which are considered central text in understanding relationship between language and gender. And these two are, number one, an edited book by Kira Hall and Mary Bolsholz, published in 1995, Gender Articulated, Language and the Socially Constructed Self, by Routledge, New York. Another text which is central in understanding the relationship between language and gender is an edited volume by Janet Holmes and Miriam Merhoff, 2003, The Handbook of Language and Gender, right? Blackwell publication. Massachusetts. Apart from these two texts, we have many other wonderful books and publications, and you can have a deeper look into this theme. And the major works and the prominent researchers who have worked in this field of language and gender, they include Deborah Tannen, Penelope Eckart, Janet Holmes, Mary Bushwalsh, Kira Hall, Deborah Cameron, Janet Sunderland, and many. And of course, this discourse was triggered by Robin Lecoff. So we will go to each of these approaches to understand language and gender, relationship between language and gender, one after the other. So let us begin with deficit approach. And as I told you that women's language is deficient, restricted, right, and subordinate to the language of men, this idea was propagated and discussed by Otto Jespersen in his 1922 book. And this idea was not challenged until the publication of Robin Lecoff's work in 1975. And Robin Lecoff's work, 1975, in a way endorses this idea, in a way comes closer to this idea. But she was the one who eloquently and very elaborately discussed this idea, deficit approach. So it describes male language as a stronger, more prestigious, and more desirable. And she argues that women are socialized into behaving like ladies. You might have heard expressions in your own mother tongue, like ladies, like girls. So any act, even a boy starts crying in public for small reasons. You might have heard people using the terms like, don't cry like a girl. So the act of crying is attributed to girl. It's ladies like, it's woman like. So, the gender biases in social structure are represented and reflected in our expressions and language biases as well. And Lecoff says that men's language is stronger, more prestigious, and desirable. This approach describes the way women's speech style includes features like tag questions. And we know what is the function of tag questions? Confirmation, seeking confirmation. Right? So she mentions these features like, tag questions, rising intonation, and hedgage. So when you're not very clear, we try to cover it up and with the help of hedges. So hedging in language is not, it's a non-specific element. A specificity is missing. So hedging is another feature she comes up with, which are expressive of uncertainty, lack of confidence, and excessive deference or politeness. Right? This approach looks at women's speech as generally inferior to that of men's and reflect their sense of personal and social inferiority. So what you see? The gap, the discrimination of gender in our social practices. The gap of gender in society is reflected in language as well. This approach looks at language from that perspective, where men's language is seen as stronger, in Lecoff's terms, stronger, prestigious, and desirable. It becomes a benchmark, right? Whereas the woman's language is seen as deficient, which lacks, specificity, which lacks, strength, and which has features like tag questions, hedging. So tag questions or hedging, that means they're not certain about it. And that is the reason why another perspective comes in here, the power. So does the power ascribed to a particular gender also plays role in deficiency in women's speech? Because women by and large are not empowered. There's a lack of equality. So does that inequality or the gap or discrimination ascribed to women play a role in determining expressions, tone, tenor, and style? So this is what deficit approach is all about. It looks at women's language as deficient. Then we have dominance approach. So the idea of dominance approach is rooted in the social discrimination and gap which is practiced in a particular culture between genders. So societies are male dominated. The men control resources. The men share the bigger pie of power, right? Women are not empowered. So this gap or this dominance of men in the social space, cultural space also is reflected in their language. So man has acquired superordinate status and woman as subordinate status. So male as a gender is superordinate and female as a gender is subordinate. This is an unfortunate situation, and this dominance approach underlines the same thing. So this approach looks at women as subordinate group whose difference in style of speech results from male supremacy and from an effect of patriarchy. This explains how language is primarily male centered. If you look at, let's say, referential expressions like gender, when we refer to gender in sentences, and when the gender is not clear, it is by default he, right? Man is a social animal. What about woman? They are antisocial or they're not social. But man includes women. The term man includes woman in this saying, in this quote, right? So a God-fearing man, it includes women as well. But by default it is male, right? Because societies and cultures are male dominated. The men enjoy power, dominance, and they have control on resources. Talbot criticizes this approach as manifestation of patriarchal social order. This approach can be cited along with difference approach, and both of them provide an early model for analysis of language and gender in social sciences. So gender gap in society is also reflected in language, in expressions, in the style, in the register, right? So this is dominance approach. Then the third approach is difference approach. Difference approach is an approach of equality. So in this approach, we look at these two genders as equal. So this is an approach of equality differentiating men and women as belonging to different subcultures as they have been socialized to do so since childhood. So this approach this treats these two genders equal and attributes the differences in socialization as a consequent result. How this socialization takes place when we are born. You can see around you, in your households, in your own family. Okay, let me give you a perspective. Suppose you are going to get a gift for a small baby, right, on his or her birthday. So you go to the shop, gift shop, and ask for gift. And this is typical of all Indian shops wherever you go, irrespective of the states and provinces and societies. You go and say, I want a gift for a baby. The first question shopkeeper asks, is it a boy or a girl? For whom do you want a gift? Now it is so significant at such an early age to mention the kind of gift you are going to get for the baby. So when you say it's boy, he will offer you truck, transformers, those male characters, chauvinist, strong characters from the cartoons, guns. When you say it's baby, girl, they will show you soft toys, kitchen set, dolls, right? So somehow we are conditioned this way. The way we are raised in a family. If you have your siblings, sister and brothers, the way we are raised in the family. We are raised with two different parameters. So this distinction in parameters, this discrimination in parameters becomes so natural to us, we are conditioned that way. So this is how we look at women. As an adult, you are conditioned to look at women in a particular perspective, with a particular gender perspective. Difference approach underlines this socialization process and treats these two as two different subcultures, and language is culturally rooted. So if you find a difference, it is not because women are inferior, it is because both of them has been raised in a particular subculture. So it treats men and women as two different social categories and who are socialized in two different cultures. This then results in varying communicative styles of men and women. Deborah Tannen is a major advocate of this position. Tannen undertook this concept further and popularized the difference approach with her work, You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation, published in 1990. And this approach develops two culture model for men and women, where children are socialized within two separate groups. And you can observe it all around you. She claimed 6 points for male and female language, and those 6 points are: the first part of the phrase is for men, the second part is for women. And what binary expression she gives? Support, status versus support. So the men are conscious of their status and position, and they are conscious in their conversation about their status and position. Whereas women's language is more supportive, accommodative, and inclusive. So, status versus support. The second phrase is independence versus intimacy. So, men are very particular about their rights, their position, their independence, whereas woman is inclusive, supportive, and wants to connect. Then the third is advice versus understanding. So the speech of men is more of instructive and didactic, whereas the woman expresses understanding and accommodating. Next is information versus feelings. Right? So men's speech is for disseminating information, facts, and very straightforward information. That doesn't mean women are not as straightforward, but women express emotions, right? So feelings are attached. So experience, feelings are attached. So men's speech is informative, or they prefer information. They extract only information, dry facts, whereas women associate feeling in their speech acts. Then orders versus proposals. Orders are exclusive, proposals are inclusive. So men's speech, we can see orders, exclusion. In women's speech, we find proposals, kind of inclusion. And then conflicts versus compromise. Women show a higher degree of flexibility and accommodation, supporting behavior and inclusion as compared to men. So this is what difference approach. So this approach looks at men and women as two different categories, social categories, who are raised and conditioned in two different subcultures. But it does not treat men and women in an asymmetrical way, in a hierarchical way, right? It looks at them at equal level. The difference lies in the two subcultures and backgrounds in which they are conditioned and raised. And the study in language and gender continues, and we witness an emergence of an independent field of study called gender study. And gender study draws heavily from multidisciplinary sources. It's not restricted to a particular discipline. So in social sciences, we see a new emergence of a new field which is very fertile and has attracted lots of attention of researchers in the field, and it draws heavily from anthropology, sociology, political science, literature, language, linguistics, and other allied disciplines. We will continue our discussion on language and gender in our a series of language and variation. When we talk about language and variation, we will continue with this discussion, and you can look into some major publications that I have mentioned here if you want to understand this concept and go deeper into it. And I hope that this gives you a broad understanding of relationship between language and gender, where we can look at gender from two different perspectives. One, the language bias and availability of structure and forms and expressions in a particular language, directed towards women or other gender, and the way both the genders use language in their speech acts. With these two perspectives, we can understand language and gender. There are three approaches available right now with us. Deficit approach, which looks at women's language deficient. Dominance approach, which underlines the social roles, dominating social roles of men, and which is reflected in the language as well. And the third is difference approach, which treats men and women as two different social categories, and it looks at the way they are raised into subcultures. It assigns equality, level of equality between these two genders. So this is it for now. We will continue our discussion. Thank you.